Hello, Painting 1 students. This is our first palette painting project demonstration. I made this drawing previously, kind of tracing off screen. So then this is my transfer of that. And if you remember some of the criteria that we decided on, I was going to do mixed media. So I transferred this with charcoal. And now I'm using a black ink marker to kind of rough in my drawing. This is a permanent marker, so it doesn't end up being affected by any wet media or oil on top of it. So this is just me redrawing that, kind of changing little pieces of it if I feel like it's a little bit off. And because this one is going to be mixed media, we go through and do a bunch of other things to this, and so that's what we're going to see in a minute. The subject was portrait imagination, so we'll talk about that as we kind of move forward as well. So I'm using a portrait from a photograph. So I traced the first part of the photograph and transferred that over. Did not make this drawing, completely on my own, but that's okay. Sometimes that helps us to get to the next step a little bit faster, since we're going to paint over all of this eventually anyway. All right, so here's our portrait, and I kind of thought of this as maybe a mother of dragons. So that's kind of what I'm doing, like a reboot. So there's two bearded dragons, which my kids have a bearded dragon at home. So here I am putting some liquid watercolor into some water. A little slow drip as it kind of spills in there. I always like that, to watch that. Then I've got a big wide brush, and I've got that marker. I have some colored pencil that's purple that I've drawn with. And then I'm just taking this blue watercolor and putting that down. I wasn't sure how much this would affect our picture. It doesn't really do too much, other than it kind of starts to smudge some things. Here's kind of a finished look of that when it's still wet. It dries a little bit more patchy, so then now you can see it dried. Because our idea was to start with a blue Imprimatura, I didn't think that the watercolor was enough. So this is an acrylic pass. So I've got a light blue, and the rest of the video is me kind of putting that light blue on there, kind of adding that to it, and then here you can see it's completely done. Now I'm going to go back into this with some more straight blue and kind of fill in those lights and shadows. So I work with a dark blue first, and that's what I'm doing. I'm kind of painting on top, deciding, do I need to change anything? Do I need to move anything around? Even with tracing a portrait out, I think you're going to find that sometimes your line that you use to try and trace it is not exactly right, or at least it doesn't feel right. So you may want to go through and try and change what you've got. So here I'm just going to go through and start to paint some of this, and I'll put on some music. now what we're going to do is I am starting to add white to this underpainting. And the idea was I was going to have the whole underpainting painted with blue and bring some of these highlights back. And the idea is now I have all my light and shadow values. I have my kind of whole picture set up in acrylic. So I went from, drawing a little bit digitally to transferring with charcoal, to drawing with a marker, to putting on some watercolor, now putting on some acrylic. And now that I have that, I'm going to go and start adding some glazes and scumbles and velaturas in oil on top of all this to finish the picture. So it was kind of a very roundabout way, but it definitely involved mixing different media together and kind of slowly figuring out what it is that I wanted to paint and how I wanted to paint it. So these are just, finding highlights next to the eyes, finding some highlights on the bearded dragons. Where's the shiniest or most bright part of the forehead? Do I need to add some white to some clouds in the background? One of the thoughts that I had, and I'm going to get to this in just a second, is going through and putting some, there's kind of like a little castle shape on the far right background. And I want to make it look like it's maybe on fire and it's burning. So putting some white there is going to take me back to that brighter area so that when I glaze in yellows or oranges or any other color, it's going to work pretty well. And it's going to have a brightness to it because there's a white base underneath. So you'll notice a lot of times when I'm putting some white there, then I almost take my finger and just kind of smudge out an edge of it to kind of soften it. It's my quick blender for acrylics. Sometimes for oil, but usually more for acrylic than anything, because acrylic dries fast versus oil does not. So oil, you can take time and get a brush and blend something really nicely if you need to. Acrylic, sometimes you have to blend something very quickly, and it's a lot easier if you use your finger, I think. You could have a second brush with you really quickly and just always grab that to use it as a blender. Even if it's just a cheapy chip brush or a dollar store brush, that would probably be fine. So just kind of building up some lights in the sky here. A lot of my technique, here's some of the castle, getting some of those highlights there. So I'm kind of thinking like, where's the fire brightest and show up the most, which is close to the castle shape. And then I'll pull some of those strokes up, kind of like flames are floating up off of there. I should probably look at some reference pictures for this, but overall, I'm kind of making a lot of this up. With with clouds, what I'm often doing to paint a cloud, you can see I'm kind of putting that in. I put a little bit of white in there, and then I kind of swirl my brush around a little bit, almost like a circular kind of blend when I go through and do that. And that gives it a nice kind of softness for the fluffy part of a cloud that's catching the light. My idea here is I'm painting the underplane of the cloud that's up above the castle because that's catching the light from all the fire. So it needs to be lit up a little bit more, a little bit brighter. So I can kind of glaze some warm colors into that versus the rest of the picture. Building up some of the highlights on the bearded dragons again. And I think we're just about done with this part of the picture. Just want to really quickly show you the finished product, not from the side like this, but kind of looking at the view more from the front. So I'm getting some highlights. I'm kind of thinking like it's almost dusk or evening, so the sun is setting back behind her. So there's my setup on the left with my picture. On the right, you have the finished painting. If we take a look at it, you can see it a little bit more zoomed in here. Overall, in this stage, I'm pretty happy with it. Let's hope that as I add color, we don't mess it up. See you later.